Hey, what's happening, Herpers? I'm Herpin Hippie, but the reptiles just call me Joe, and I am back this week to address the controversy and discuss the solution as to whether or not reptile carpet is dangerous to leopard geckos, and if it is dangerous, what is the best substrate for leopard geckos? So in this video, I'm going to be picking up exactly where my last video left off. I'm doing some rearranging in my reptile room, but Jupiter, my leopard gecko, isn't just going into a new spot, she is also getting an upgraded habitat because people in the comments and discussion over the years has put attention onto whether or not Reptile Carpet is really a good option for leopard geckos or really any other reptiles. So in this video, as somebody who has used Reptile Carpet for years, honestly, without any issues, I want to address what I think about those concerns and why, even though I think if you use Reptile Carpet, you might be safe, why I'm still going to be changing what I've done for Jupiter for years, pretty much her entire life, and what factors you might want to consider if you are going to be adopting a leopard gecko, if you have a leopard gecko, or are thinking about making the substrate change yourself. So if all that sounds interesting, I hope that you will stay tuned, that you'll let me know what reptile that you might be setting up a habitat for that has you watching this video in the first place. Drop a like if you enjoy the video, and I think those are all the YouTuber things set out of the way, so with that, let's get right into it. Hey, how's it going, Bojangles? So like I said in the opener of this video, this week's video is picking up right where my last video left off, and so I just got Bojangles back into his habitat, and now it is time for me to start setting up Jupiter's new habitat and talk about why I am not putting her back on Reptile Carpet. So for starters here, I'm going to show you why I am going to be moving Jupiter on to for her new bedding. I am not going to be just putting her on one bedding type. I'm actually going to be mixing up some Repti sand along with some Zilla jungle mix. But that's not all I'm going to be using in this mix. I've got at least one other substrate I plan on adding, but I don't have it in front of me. So while I get the jungle mix and Repti sand kind of spread out and mixed together, I'll talk about the two biggest health and safety risks for reptiles that I hear associated with using any sort of reptile carpet. So the first and probably most serious risk that you will hear people bring up regarding reptile carpet is bacteria. And while yes, technically bacteria can grow on reptile carpet, I know some of the brands are advertised as being antimicrobial, and that might lull some keepers into the false sense of security that it is okay to go weeks without cleaning your enclosure because it's antimicrobial. Somehow it's going to keep the bacteria from growing and your reptile's habitat will stay a clean, healthy environment regardless. And if that is what you think reptile carpet does, then yes, reptile carpet is not going to work for you. But the thing that I think is kind of funny about the bacteria argument with reptile carpet is that's kind of an issue in all reptile enclosures. These are habitats for living creatures. They're eating, sleeping, drinking, and defecating in these enclosures, so there is going to be some bacteria growth no matter what substrate you're using. And as a keeper, it's our job to keep their habitats clean. So while I recognize there's maybe some risk in the marketing around reptile carpet that kind of lends itself towards maybe new keepers not being as on top of their reptile maintenance as they should be, I kind of hesitate to call that a problem with reptile carpet itself. And a big reason for that is I look at reptile carpet as kind of a step up from one of the most sanitary options out there, and that is the boring paper towel and newspaper bedding that you tend to see a lot of breeders or just people with a lot of reptiles use for leopard geckos and other small species of reptile. Now, I don't think barren tubs or enclosures with just paper towels in it are really ideal setups, but the one thing that they are good at is keeping a sanitary environment, and that is why so many breeders use such minimalistic setups for their reptiles. And in my view, using reptile carpet instead of paper towels is just kind of one step above using paper towels. It is nice because you don't have to waste paper towels every week, you do get to reuse it. But like I said, with any reptile enclosure, you need to make sure that it stays clean. And with reptile carpet, you can't just remove the spot of it that your reptile pooped on, or well, maybe you could, but that sounds like a lot of work. Compared to just ripping out the soiled paper towel, you have to stay on top of cleaning their carpet more or less every week, at least every other week, depending on the species of reptile. If you're using it for a bearded dragon, you're going to be cleaning it multiple times a week if they're pooping on it. If you're using it for a leopard gecko, you can definitely get away with only changing your reptile carpet out once a week, or sometimes even every other week. Heck, during brumation, you might only need to change out the reptile carpet once a month, once every other month, depending how hard your leopard gecko sleeps through the winter. And at the end of the day, I think the reptile carpet looks a little bit nicer and is a little bit easier for geckos to walk on than paper towels that can easily slide around under them. So as long as you are staying on top of cleaning the reptile carpet, I really have a hard time taking the reptile carpet being a breeding ground for bacteria argument seriously, because that is going to be an issue for any unkept reptile enclosure. But if you stay up on your reptiles' maintenance, you are in there removing fecal matter, cleaning up after them, keeping an eye on them regularly, then you aren't really going to run into any issues with reptile carpet. as far as cleanliness goes that you wouldn't also run into with loose substrate. And now before I talk about the pros and cons of loose substrate and why I decided I'm still going to switch Jupiter over to loose substrate today, I'm going to address the second biggest concern that I hear with reptile carpet, and that is nails and toes getting stuck in the loose fibers. But first, did you see the third type of substrate I just added? I forgot to mention it while it was going by, but that was the sphagnum moss that I'm adding to bulk up the kind of more humid forest side of the enclosure. I'm going to be adding some more of that later, and I will talk about it more then. But for now, getting back to talking about the risk of reptiles getting their toes or nails caught up in reptile carpet, is this the concern that finally made me make the switch from reptile carpet to loose substrate after all of these years? Well, no, this isn't really the reason I decided to make the switch either. And that's because in all of my time breeding leopard geckos and all of my time reptile keeping, I've never seen them seriously get their claws stuck in a way that was an issue. I've actually never seen a leopard gecko get their claws stuck. Their nails tend to stay pretty small. If your leopard gecko's nails are getting really extra long for some reason, clipping them is an option, but it just usually isn't necessary. And even when I have seen leopard geckos with really long nails, I've never seen them manage to get them stuck in a way that could actually cause an injury like people warn could happen with reptile carpets. Now, bearded dragons, on the other hand, if you aren't regularly clipping their nails can get long enough that they can get kind of tied up inside the threads of the carpet. Again, I've never seen this happen in a way that was so severe it could cause an injury. Usually they kind of try to lift their leg, realize it's stuck, and move their leg at a slightly different angle, and it comes free. And it just really isn't as big a deal as I hear people make of it. Now, that's just been my experience. If you're watching this video and you've got smoke coming off of your keyboard right now because you've experienced otherwise or had some reptile that ended up getting injured by their reptile carpet, please let me know down in the comments. But other than people just talking about it as a hypothetical issue or something that could happen, I've never seen this be a real issue. But let me know if I'm wrong on this one. Maybe I just had a really good run of luck with reptile carpets. So those tend to be the two big concerns that people have with reptile carpeting, and those are the reasons why I don't share those concerns. So if I'm not concerned with the bacteria problem with reptile carpet, or the getting their nails stuck problem with reptile carpet, why am I doing it? Well, for starters, just look at the enclosure. Like I said, I prefer reptile carpet over paper towels if you're trying to do a minimalistic sanitary reptile setup. But if you're regularly cleaning up after your gecko and you can stay on top of their maintenance, well, this is clearly cooler looking than paper towels or reptile carpet. And it goes beyond just how it looks to me. From the first moment that I put Jupiter in this enclosure, it was so clear that she was just taking it all in. She had new smells to take in. She was putting her nose down into the bedding. It kind of freaked me out at first. I was worried. I'm like, oh gosh, there it goes. She's eating the bedding already, which is one of the main risk factors that people try to tell you, oh, don't do loose bedding because they can eat the bedding and it can cause impaction issues. So I was a little nervous seeing that, but nope, she was just smelling. I could see her kind of blowing some of the loose bedding towards and away from her nose while she was breathing, but it didn't look like it was making her sneeze or anything. She was just trying to sense her environment. So in the most simplest of terms, I'm upgrading Jupiter's enclosure today because it is just an all-around more enriching environment for her to live in. Now, I'm not saying this is what everybody who keeps leopard geckos should do. I've already mentioned that for keepers with large collections or people who are breeding a large number of leopard geckos, it makes sense to do the minimalistic sanitary setups, especially because if you are just breeding them, you aren't keeping them in those tubs forever. They are hopefully going out to homes where they will get a more enriching environment to live in. But as the keeper with that large collection or the breeder, your number one priority is making sure that you are meeting all of their health needs, which means making sure that their habitat is clean, but also making sure that insects aren't getting away from them and that they aren't just stressing out your leopard gecko if they decide not to eat their insects that day. And that's easier to see if they've got a really minimalistic enclosure with just a paper towel you can quickly change out. Oh, and on the note of quickly being able to change out the paper towel or reptile carpeting, if you do decide to go the reptile carpeting route because you only have one reptile and you don't need to worry about having 50 pieces of reptile carpeting, I do recommend that you have at least 2 reptile carpets per enclosure that you set up with reptile carpeting, and that is because it makes cleaning days so much easier if you always have one clean carpet and one dirty carpet. So if you do go the reptile carpet route, that's how I would recommend doing it. And as long as you are keeping it clean like you would keep any other reptile enclosure clean, then I really don't see any way the reptile carpet is going to harm or really endanger your reptile in any way. Now, all that being said, now that I've had time to have Jupiter on loose substrate and I've had the enjoyment of watching her explore and take in her new environment, I can definitely say that while I don't think reptile carpet is a risk to your gecko, this is so much better to give them a naturalistic setup or a closer to naturalistic setup for them to explore. Now, if I have sold you on trying to switch out your solid leopard gecko bedding for some loose leopard gecko bedding, whether that's going to be making the switch from tile, paper towels, reptile carpet, to some other sort of loose substrate, it's not all fun and games. There are a few risks that you need to be aware of if you are going to use this type of setup. The first and the biggest risk to be aware of if you are switching your reptile to some sort of loose substrate is the one that I've already mentioned and you've probably already thought of, and that is the risk of impaction. Impaction is just the fancy reptile keeper word for constipation caused by them eating stuff that they shouldn't eat, and that has a higher likelihood of happening if they are on some sort of loose bedding. And besides paper towels and reptile carpet just being really easy to clean for breeders, this is another reason why breeders tend to use solid bedding instead of loose bedding, because with feeding as many mouths as they're feeding, they just can't be as intentional with feeding every leopard gecko and aware of everything that every leopard gecko might be eating. So that is just another reason why a lot of breeders tend to go with using a solid bedding like paper towels or Reptile Carpet. But the good news is, if you want to switch to a more natural loose bedding or loose substrate for your gecko, there are some pretty easy ways to avoid them eating too much of their bedding and thereby avoid the risk of impaction. The first thing you'll want to be cautious of is what you use in your bedding mix. I used Repti Sand, which is pretty much just play sand. Yeah, it's branded to be used in reptile enclosures, but you could also use just play sand in place of Repti Sand. What you don't want to use is any of the walnut shell sands or any of the calcium powder sands. Now, admittedly, I am not speaking from firsthand experience here, but I have heard a lot of other keepers talk about having issues with their leopard geckos enjoying the taste of the calcium sand. If you have never kept leopard geckos before, you might be surprised that in addition to a water bowl, they also have a calcium dish, because leopard geckos will just go right up to the calcium powder and lick it. And unfortunately, if you are using one of the calcium sand alternatives, that's supposed to be safer because it's got calcium in the sand, so if they eat it, it's good. But the problem is, it can actually encourage them to eat more of it than they otherwise would. It isn't just pure calcium powder like you buy in their supplements. It is an actual sand with higher levels of calcium in it, and that can have a tendency to build up in their GI and eventually cause the impaction issues that people tend to worry about with loose substrate. So the two types of sand to avoid are calci sand, any of the colors of calci sand, and the walnut sand. Just go with some good old-fashioned sand that's in the ground. Now, besides avoiding types of sand that might be appealing to your reptile to eat, you can also do things like feed them outside of their enclosure to cut down on the amount of bedding that they're eating. This has been a little bit of a 50-50 thing that I've been doing with Jupiter since moving her into this enclosure. Sometimes I feed her fully out of the enclosure. Now that she's on the ground, it's easy for her to come walking right out of it during feeding time. But I also haven't had an issue with feeding her inside of her enclosure. I use the tongs to keep the food off the ground. She bites it, tends to eat it 99% of the time without letting it touch the substrate. And if she's eating any substrate, it's got to be a negligible amount. I'm not concerned about it, and it just hasn't been a problem for her. But if you notice whatever reptile you're feeding is having trouble with keeping the substrate off their food, or the poor things get in mouths full of substrate when they miss their food and strike the bedding instead, then you may want to feed them outside of the enclosure. Is it an extra step every feeding day? Yeah, a little bit. But if your reptile doesn't mind eating after they've been handled or just removed from their enclosure and put into a feeding bin or wherever you're feeding them, then I'd say go ahead and do it, because it does just make feedings go by that much easier, and your reptile gets to take advantage of the much more enriching enclosure all the other hours of the week that you aren't directly feeding them for. So with all of that taken into account, the very last note I have on picking a sand for your reptile is, if you go with a colored sand, we're not talking about the calcium sands or the walnut sands anymore. You already know that those are bad, but there are some just colored sands. Use at your own risk. I'm not aware of any health concerns that can come from using the colored sands. I was tempted to use the black sand option in this enclosure. I thought it would just look neat, but I've heard people have issues with, and I have seen a few examples of the color from the reptile sand coming off of the sand and actually dyeing the reptile, especially if they're a lighter colored reptile like, well, Jupiter here, or if you have any other sort of albino reptile. You might want to stay away from the colored sands just so you don't accidentally end up dyeing your pet. And now, with feeding on loose substrate addressed and what to use for the sandy side of the enclosure, I'm going to talk about the other half of the enclosure. This side of the enclosure might have confused some people that just think of leopard geckos as being a desert lizard, but they spend a lot of their time in kind of damp, darker, and moist burrows underground. Yeah, the surface of the desert is very dry and arid, which is why I've provided her with this side of the enclosure, to be a more dry space and to come out and do some hunting in, but I've also left the entire left side of the enclosure to more closely mimic the forested side of their range and the burrows that they spend a lot of their time in. And this side of the enclosure will also help Jupiter out when it comes time for her to shed her skin, and I've even stuffed that back corner and the underside of her tree trunk with sphagnum moss. That way she can use that area in particular as a humid hide when it's time for her to shed her skin. On the humid side and the arid side of the enclosure, I used both the Repti sand and the jungle mix, but as you can clearly see, I used more jungle mix on the humid side and more Repti sand on the arid side of the enclosure. And the only real thoughts that I have to add here is other options for your humid side could be Repti bark or coconut husk. Both of those are okay options. Some leopard geckos, especially when the cocoa fiber, if you're using just cocoa fiber, some leopard geckos can have trouble getting their footing on it. I haven't seen that as an issue, but I've never used just cocoa fiber in a leopard gecko enclosure. I've used it in small parts of their enclosures inside of humid hides, and I've never had an issue with it in that role, but just something to consider if you're going to be using coconut fiber for a large part of your reptile enclosure. Repti chips, I don't have anything bad to say about them. I enjoy using them. I just want to try out something new, which is why I went with the jungle mix here. And then the last thing I can think to add is everything I said about sand and impaction risk kind of applies here too. You want to try to minimize the amount of bedding that they're eating. A little bit here and there isn't the end of the world, but if your reptile has a lot of issues with eating bedding, Bojangles, I'm looking at you, you might want to consider doing the minimalistic reptile carpet or paper towel setup for that reptile, or just having a separate feeding container, which is what I'm going to opt to do with Bojangles in the future, and what I might have to do for Jupiter, but so far it doesn't seem like it's going to be necessary for her. And with that, I think I've shared all of my thoughts on what I think the best leopard gecko substrate is. I hope that you will let me know down in the comments what you think of Jupiter's new enclosure, and let me know if you think there's anything I overlooked while talking about ideal substrates for leopard geckos or just reptiles in general. And if you made it this far and enjoyed the video, please hit the like button so I know to make more videos like this in the future. And with that, I'd like to thank all the patrons that make it possible for this hippie to keep herping, starting with my head herpers, Ali Ward, Amanda Lynn, Deborah Torgerson, Jane Cabingirl, JCH, Lindsay Justice, Sierra Sicard, and Tiffany H. Thank you so much to all of my head herpers at the highest tier level, and thank you very much to all of the other patrons at the other tier levels whose beautiful names are scrolling up your screen now. And if you would like to join the amazing patrons of this channel and helping me create videos as often as I do, there will be a link below this video where you can sign up to become a patron for as little as $3 a month, and that will get you credit as a patron that keeps this channel possible at the end of all of my full videos, along with special perks inside of Patreon. So if that interests you, or you just want to help me keep creating videos for this channel, check out my Patreon at the link under this video. And with that, one last thank you so much to everybody who watched this video all the way to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your week. I really hope you don't... I'm doing this voiceover and I've got Cleo roaming behind me and she just started going under the couch. Anyway, I was going to say I really hope you don't replace your leopard gecko's calcium supplement with calcisand, but in honor of Cleo almost getting away from me here, I really hope that your red-tailed boa doesn't escape this week. But most of all, I hope that you just keep herping.